Okay, so this event is being recorded to put up on YouTube. I have spotlighted the videos of the speakers. So if technology works, only the videos of the speakers will be recorded. So that's the plan. So your voice only will be recorded, not your video. And even if your video is recorded, your name won't be. So the way it works in Change Friend or Foe, if you can go into menti.com and type in 31 69 82. And then you'll be presented with a screen, which will ask you, what brought you here? So we already had participation from a couple of attendees on this call, and thank you very much for that. But we're curious to hear more from you, because the session is about what you want to cover, and it will give us the building bricks that we can use to explore during the session. Right, so already have a couple of replies. Curiosity, interesting in learning more from others. Anything else? Discover new ways to work with, wanting to explore change and accountability, curiously enough. Right, need a refresher on change. Wow, even with the last 9 months, impressive. What's standing out to our speakers from this point?
I think for me, my favorite word is curiosity. So definitely curiosity about change. And there's also someone wrote about curiosity about making change more human-centric. And I think that's really important. And I know I've been speaking to the speakers individually, but if you think about organizations, they're made up of people who have relationships and kind of gather around to work on a primary task. And actually curiosity about how to really bring the humanness back to quite an emotional experience that really kind of takes us back to quite infantile, if I think about it from a psychoanalytic perspective, very infantile early experiences of security, safety, and change. So that's very much where my curiosity is lying.
Curiosity about curiosity. Nice. Andy?
I saw one there about challenges and emotions behind change. And I think that for me, certainly in the areas of well, coaching or therapy, I guess, in terms of helping people make changes, it is the challenge and it is the emotion that needs to be addressed. And when those two can combine together, then people will spontaneously change. So that's what I'm interested in.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I'm noticing there's quite a few dimensions here mentioning about ambiguity, complexity, looking at the various different dimensions that change, navigating change and working with change brings into the context of, as Roberta, said, human beingness of it. As I say to all organizations, you take people out of organizations and all you've got left are fixed assets. So the dimensions here about that change is not a complex dimension that leaders, particularly leaders of today, have to work with. It's a key topic, and the environment we're in at the moment is talking to a lot about the dimensions of having to work with and navigate continuous change.
I think for me, just to add on to what you're saying, Catherine, what it really sparked me is that I think we use this word change. I know we're going to talk about language, but I think we talk about change as if it's a homogenous concept.
Yep.
Change is change. And reality is that made of so many different elements at so many different levels. And so I think there's something about naming and specificity. And I think, again, from a psychoanalytic perspective, making the unconscious conscious, really naming and making things known, so then it can actually be worked with in a constructive way.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I found in my practice is when we don't know what we don't know about the context that we're working within, whether it's in organizations, whether it's we're trying to transition careers, it's that not knowing and not understanding those factors that contribute to it that make it even more challenging, and it actually needs to be in practice.
Absolutely. And just building on that point by Roberta, as far as language we use, we're just curious to hear from you good people, using Mentimeter, of course. If you couldn't use the word change, what words would you use? have one straight off the bat.
Interesting.
Yeah. Some people are most okay. We have two, so we can. So, which ones do we have so far? It's racking up. Unlearn, learn, transition, agility, adjustment. Lots of words beginning with A. Interesting. Journey, becoming 180. So instead of words, we're using numbers. Also good. Different ways to deal with change. Life, that's quite stoical and philosophical at the same time. Movement, upheaval, update, overcome.
I love the unlearn, learn. You know, any kind of process that we're engaged with will require a process of needing to unlearn or let go of something that is known in order to be able to move into something that is unknown. And that's the natural part of any transformation or any change process.
And that really spoke to me as well, because I really think about the loss associated with change and the task of mourning. And I think, again, from a psychoanalytic perspective, how change is often associated with loss and not having and being without. And that can be really anxiety provoking, as opposed to thinking when you let go of something, you do make room for something new. And it is that process of mourning and changing your relationship to the change process, which is actually really, I think, to use the biggest word there, transformational and really quite creative.
Absolutely. And as you say that, you know, if we think about the fact that, you know, our world is in a constant process of transition and change anyway, but our Western mindsets have become so fixed on this reality of, you know, we can manage change. Well, if we could manage change, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today. So it's all about the nature of the relationships that we have with change. Nothing to do with the fact that our environment is constantly changing. We can't stop day and night happening. You know, we have no control over the weather, yet somehow, some way, with this whole Western frame of reference about we can manage change, and now people are realizing they can't manage change, is really starting to come to the forefront of people's awareness. And it's like, okay, so we need a different way of engaging with it. And it's going back to your point, Roberta, it's all about the nature of the relationship that we have with it.
I think from my point of view, there's something perhaps in our language when we talk about change as a process and as a series of stages, and yet there probably is an alternative view to that, to not suggest that change is a stage, it's a state. So actually, if we want people to transform, which is a really interesting word, it's a dominant word on there, then it's understanding that the state that they're in around change rather than the stage they're in. And it may be that we focus too much on ideas about stages of change, the idea about letting go of something, the idea about mourning something, the idea about being ready for something, because the evidence may well point to, certainly at the individual level of change, to a counterintuitive opposite view of that.
Oh, it's an interesting point, isn't it? One of the factors that I found through my research was, going back 20 odd years, is sometimes the process can be fixed around the method. I call it the methodology mindset. You know, if we follow a process, then therefore we're going to get an effective outcome. And then people get a bit bent out of shape by the fact that when they're following a method, actually the method is no guarantee of the outcome. And that's why a lot of organizational projects, what's the percentage? Something like 73% of organizational projects fail. Well, right. Because people follow a method hoping that that's going to get them an outcome. And, you know, if we could live our life by following a method, then we'd have been in a very different type of world than we are today, I think.
And if you think about the industry around change, you know, organizational change, or if you think about things like smoking cessation, or, you know, it's sort of partly involved in the world of recovery from addiction. If you think about the investments that are made in methodology and processes, and somebody's making a lot of money about that. But actually, if the methodology doesn't really work for you, and you've got an organizational process which is designed to take people through these distinct stages of change, and it doesn't really work, then what are we investing our money in, and why are we all coming on things like this to try and get better at managing change, where maybe change is a state, not a stage?
I think that's really important, and I think it's about understanding this, because I think part of my thinking about why people want manuals and methods, and I love this idea about the methodology mindset, it's an anxiety, it's a defense against being out of control, it's a defense about so many things. And I think someone put in the chat a threat, and I think with that then becomes, if we have this, we can just do it, it'll be fine, we'll get through it, as opposed to actually immersing oneself in the process, letting the things come up and actually seeing where that takes you. But that is too anxiety provoking to do that, because you don't know where you're going to come up. And businesses need to make money, they need to have outcomes, they need KPIs, because the fantasy is that's what makes a business good.
Which all goes back to the whole area around the Western mindset. You know, our Western mindsets are basically built around simplicity and control.
Yeah.
So the method, if we follow the method, that gives us this false illusion of the fact that somehow we are in control of something. Yeah. And if we can see the method as in the process to follow, a lot of these change methodologies, the latest one, Agile, is the big one at the moment. But it is no guarantee of success. But more predominantly than that, it leans straight into, if something's complex, that's bad. And therefore, if we use the method is going to take away the levels of complexity. And actually, the reality is, if we don't honour complexity and work with it and engage with the ambiguities that are associated with it, we can't navigate change.
Exactly. And I think with that, so important that I think one of the defences is actually, if the change process fails, the individual can be blamed, as opposed to taking a more vulnerable position, which is actually, let's look at the system, let's look at the wider complex different factors and think about what went wrong. But it's much easier to go down to the individual level and say it didn't work because of X.
Absolutely. And again, if you look at this whole notion of hierarchy in organizations, everybody talks about hierarchy as being a bad thing. But actually, the reality is it's nothing to do with the way in which the organization is structured. You're always going to have new people coming in, learning new and different knowledge and experience. You're always going to have more senior people in that hierarchy will have more knowledge and experience. But it's to do with, as you point out, how does it come together as an integrated system, as opposed to, if you hold somebody to account, an individual who's accountable and responsible, that's a risk mitigation strategy. They can be taken out and another person can be put in. And that's a simplistic way of how you deal with it. But it's nothing to do with that in reality of it. It's how do organizations utilize power? Do they utilize power through collective as mutuality-based environments, or do they utilize it through individual accountability and responsibility, which generates fear? Makes it even more messy.
Absolutely. And I can see definitely, Trevor, you've been nodding a lot. So that resonates. So I'm just curious, what are you nodding to?
I'm nodding to the fact that I have to learn how to use Zoom, and that's changed for me. I think I'm nodding because of this interplay. I was the person that put accountability up earlier. I think there's this real interplay between the fear that comes with accountability, but also a sense of control that comes with accountability that can help to offset some of the fear of change. And then, as a couple of people have said, if you're in a position where you do have that accountability, you don't share it, then you tend to adopt an idea of, well, I can design change and I can make it happen and I can direct people in the way that it needs to go, and that kind of famously and certainly from my experience doesn't work. So there's some gap, I think, in real expertise around how to create genuine involvement, not lip service involvement, and share the responsibility for making change go. But that requires people who are currently accountable to let go a little bit.
Absolutely, and it is about shared accountability and responsibility. And I found this out probably about 20 years ago. that when you have an environment that is built on shared accountability and responsibility, so collectively they feel accountable and responsible for everyone else's delivery and their work and the organizational agenda, they will engage with it and they will support each other. But if they feel that they are only held to account for what they do and what they don't do, then the chances of engaging with others to support them to navigate environments of continuous change is actually fairly low. And it does generate, going back to your point, fear-based cultures. And of course, more fear, the less you can then engage with the world of ambiguity and complexity and work from a process of true transformation.
Absolutely. And what research indicates about neuroticism, which I love, and Kate mentioned several times about fear in the chat, and it is that change increases neuroticism in the population. But there is a not magic, but there seems to be a linchpin, is that it makes a difference between your increase in neuroticism and negative emotional affect and actually feeling worse. And the difference, what it makes, if people feel they have the tools to cope with change. If they have the tools made available to them to cope with this as individuals, it actually doesn't result in a negative emotional affect, so increases the rates of neuroticism. And I thought it's fascinating that instead of actually listening to your more neurotic colleagues, identifying what tools they need to feel comfortable, and then proceeding with change, we usually kind of try to silence them with better PR and saying how awesome it's going to be, rather than listening to this internal risk department that some of us have. And some of us have a megaphone with that risk department, some of us not. But how we can leverage that neuroticism for the good and give people the tools that stop them feeling worse as a result of it.
And I think that's lovely. And I think that's really important, because as you were talking, Nikita, the word that popped into my mind was resistance. And I think often the word resistance get a really bad rep, just like the word defense mechanisms. And for me, I really think that this is about how can we reframe it and see it as a protective mechanism, that actually the resistance and defense mechanisms, they protect the self and preserve relationships. And actually it's a communication, it's a symptom of something. And I think as humans, we have an extraordinary capacity to remain the same and an extraordinary capacity not to listen. So we can then think there's so many elements of data that is just ignored in any process that are so important and could be so beneficial.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I mean, it's funny how the word resistance is used almost like people are, pushing their hands up and pushing themselves away from it. But it is actually a psychological construct of anxiety. Mm-hmm. and people's inability to be able to connect and relate to ambiguity and the unknown dimensions of what's coming next, because people quite like it, and this is where the methodology mindset comes back in. They quite like it when they can see the pathway ahead, when they know what the steps ahead look like. But actually the reality of it is it's like walking up a spiral staircase. You can't see immediately what's in front of you when you're navigating change. So the more anxiety that people have associated with not knowing and not being able to see, the more then you start to see these delightful behaviors that get given this label of resistance, which are technically, if you look at it from a psychological construct point of view, it's fight, freeze or flight behavior. Mm-hmm. And that's purely anxiety driven. So, if you're not engaging with that and you're giving it a bad label of resistance, you're deliberately resisting, actually what people are doing is they're fearful.
I'm finding the conversation fascinating. There's a few things I might want to just refer back to. I think something you said, Nikita, earlier about neuroticism is increased by change. I was just interested in, again, language on change. Well, what does change mean? Is change is that bad change? And then that makes people become more worried about something, because that may not be true if it was good change. And what do we mean by neuroticism anyway? Is it an increased awareness of risk and how to manage that risk? And so if you think about neuroticism, as I'm sure you know, is a personality construct. Well, for many of us, that's what keeps us safe, but it also keeps us able, and lots of high performing people have high levels of neuroticism. So again, it's just about the language. What do we mean when we think about the responses to change? And also when we think about words like resistance, there's a sense of, well, if people are resistant, if that's anxiety, and people are more might need to feel more settled if they understand the steps involved in making change. It's also, again, perhaps counterintuitive, but when we think about people's recovery from addictions, for example, many people recover spontaneously and change their habits spontaneously and have no need to understand the steps involved or to be ready at all. So there's a danger in all of this, is that we get a bit lost in the idea that that we need to go through these stages, or resistance is about not knowing enough about a stage. I think that a lot of the work that, and obviously the research that I would know about and I'm involved in my world, is that change happens when people want to and feel they ought to, and those two things combine. Now, there's a huge bunch of other things around that, internal thinking states, external cues, but actually, we probably don't need, in all cases, to understand the process or go through a process of mourning or losing anything or anticipating, because certainly if people want to change stuff they don't like about themselves or they want to do differently, they'll kind of do it anyway when they're ready. So the process of working with people with change is to understand about their relative motivations towards things, but it probably doesn't require some of the things that we might think that it requires: letting go, anticipating. Of course, that's what the individual might be experiencing, but not everybody needs to go through those stages in order to successfully manage a change for themselves.
Absolutely. And oh, Lind, I noticed you raised your hand, and then over to Danny.
Hey, just a quick question. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering what type of change we're talking about here. I'm wondering what, there seems to be a few different things going on as I'm listening.
It's a great question, isn't it? Because it's change gets used as a kind of a catch-all phrase for different faceted dimensions of human beingness. And, you put a word in front of it, like, people change versus technology change versus, it's fascinating. I've started to see again, and this comes back from, if we look again, Western society of knowledge is power. But if you look at it, change has been given now so many different dimensions that's created this context of splitting. So, as we were saying earlier, if you take people outside of organisations, all you've got like fixed assets. I don't know if you'd seen the Panorama programme a couple of weeks ago on this COVID app, but all they'd done was focus on, they hadn't looked at the dimensions associated with the system. They purely focused on the technology and the app side. And then they had these whistleblowers that were going out talking about all the different facets that were in the system that were connected to this app that they hadn't looked at and hadn't considered. But it's fascinating when you see how change has now been chopped up and stuck into different buckets, and people are starting to look at it through very different lenses. And then it starts to get they start making things even more complex than they actually need to be in reality.
Yes. And
yeah, I was going to say that we talked about friction and resistance, and actually, if you think about both of those, they can create creativity, because because you're changing doesn't mean to say that you're automatically going in a different direction. It just means that you should be building on what you've done, and don't throw what you've done out, because that's been a lot of effort from somebody somewhere. And so I think the language you use in change, whether it's change management or changing who you are, or your behaviors, whatever it is, you should just say, this is where we are, this is where we're going to be going, and this is why we are going where we're going, because of X, Y, and Z, and make sure that there's a collaboration in there, because without that, you can't be told to change, because that's not going to happen. If I said to you, you've got to lose weight or you've got to stop drinking, yeah, okay, fair enough, we all know. However, that's not going to, but if I say why, then I'm far more likely psychologically to be less resistant and become more creative in how I do it or what I'm going to be doing.
I think you raise a really interesting point there, which goes back to purpose. And you see so much how purpose is just overlooked, and no investment in time is spent in helping to clarify purpose. So therefore then you've got lots of things all running around, kind of chasing their hats, trying to work out what is the purpose of this change, when actually you can quite take a lot of complexity and a lot of anxiety out of the system by purely investing time, energy and effort on clarifying what that purpose is.
Yeah, and I think people think of change as having to be linear, and it's sort of like convergent thinking, this is where we're going, where actually if you have change which is divergent, you've got a whole raft of new ideas of possibilities that people are more likely to jump onto the bandwagon to want to do that. At least that's what I found when I've been running these program things.
Completely.
It's really interesting, Lindy. Sorry, Catherine. I think that this idea about a linear process, as if we think about, I guess, in organizational psychology and also probably in health psychology, the trans-theoretical change idea and the Procrastinate and Di Clementi process is quite a well-established process that has a sense of there are stages and this is a linear sequence. And yet the argument against those types of change models are, as you say, it's not linear, that actually people can organizationally or individually can make quite major changes apparently quite suddenly, even in response to small triggers. They don't necessarily need to go through those stages at all. And so if we think about even our own responses to change, it's probably a bit messier. If we really think about the changes that we've experienced in our own personal lives or perhaps in organizational lives, we are quite messy and not very linear as individuals very often, and yet we still make changes. So it's interesting why we might want to bring in linear and sequential ways of thinking about change, when really what we're trying to do, I suppose, is trying to understand at the individual level, what are somebody's plans? How do they evaluate those plans? What are their motivations? Do they change? What are their impulses? What are their responses to change? How much is kind of habitual for them? How much is learned behavior? And what's the external environment like? And how is that having an impact upon individual states? So probably is a really good thing that you brought up, Lindy, about this idea about organizationally trying to go through linear sequences probably doesn't help us. And it's probably also an industry that maybe we're all a bit invested in. I'm wondering whether we're investing in it a bit too much.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you think about process and structure, the people who love that sort of thing are the people who are very linear generally. And they're the ones who create it for the rest of us to just jump on the bandwagon to follow. And to my mind, it's kind of the worst. If you tell me to do this, go down this process, I'm thinking, well, the process is A to F, and I know I can miss out C and D. I'm going to miss out C and D. But there are people who created that process, and you need to do every single step. And that's the biggest turnoff if you're trying to get change or not.
Right. And actually what you described there is what is called night move thinking. Skipping a few steps and making connections which are obvious to you.
Yeah.
And just from personality side, it seems to be quite specific personalities which are attracted to being change agents. It's a self-selecting sample.
Yeah.
And quite often those people don't have linear thinking. And they're trying to create plans for people that do, but they're not communicating with each other. And they're all drink together, no, separately. So the group of change managements drink alone and they go, they're not getting how important this change is. And the really conscientious people in their suits and ties, of course, go drinking as well. And it's like, we brought in a bunch of mad people here and we're paying them how much? It's not appreciating even this individual differences, which can be sometimes quite a linchpin.
And I think we ought to be, if we're talking about change, yes, you've got a process of some kind, but you've also got your emotional connection with it. And if you don't take the people's emotional feel, how they're feeling, why they're thinking what they do, the two activities need to be coordinated somehow. And they're not going to be stuck together, but they're going to have touch points along that journey from A to B or A to Z or whatever it is. You're going to have to bring in the emotional side of people because it's people that drive it. It's not a process doesn't drive itself. It's us that drive the process.
I think you raise a really interesting point both of you about this linear left to right, which is going back to Nikita's point, which is why I ended up going and studying Buddhist psychology, because Western mindset, again, is another trait of this left to right simplicity. And when the Buddhists look at this through the notion of the fact that change is actually a process of transcendence, as I mentioned earlier, it's like walking up a spiral staircase. So they don't, this whole concept of linearity and left to right thinking is built into the Western frame of reference of how organizations function.
Absolutely. Danny, over to you.
So I was going to say the linearity is actually not Western, it's North European and North American. So if you go into Southern Europe, they have a circular sort of cyclical view of time. So it's slightly different. I think so I'm one of those self-selected change people. I'm totally that personality. I'll miss the steps, I'll jump. I'm not very linear myself. But I see the value in the methodology, and the value in the methodology is that gives me something to communicate to people who aren't like me. So we can say, well, this is where we're at, and this is what we're doing, and this is what we hope to achieve with it. Now, it's not how necessarily I want to be talked to, but I get that there are other people who need that to comfort them. So I
said the sticky
don't
point.
hate it.
You need to have the two activities, if you like, going along together, so that you have those sticking points so both people feel that they're part of that going forward. You can't just have the linear people and then the divergent thinkers.
I guess you can have many methods, can't you? The question is, do you lean into the methodology to achieve the outcomes? And that's what happens, that's the trait. Because you can have lots of methods for doing lots of different things, but it's when people rely on the method to gain the outcome from the change process rather than actually engaging with the levels of complexity and ambiguity that are a natural part of the process of any kind of change that you're trying to facilitate. I think that's the challenge with it. It's when you think that the method or the linear left to right way of looking at it, and if I follow these instructions, or if I follow these steps 1 to 10, I'm going to get a positive outcome. Well, you may and you may not. And a lot of it is to do with the fact that as we step into any kind of change process, what we think at the outset before we start that journey can be something completely different as we start to walk down that path. And if we don't take those factors into consideration, that's where it starts to become messy. Yes, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I think the change process itself, and this is why I disagree with measures of success and those kinds of things, because the change process itself it's a journey of discovery, and you go through that to learn more about the change, and you have to make a decision when you learn more, is this still a good change? And you might decide no. And on those stats, that looks like a failed change, but actually it's not a failed change. You just learned more about it. You decided that's not the right route to go down. So it was a good decision, but you had to go through the process to figure that out.
Absolutely. And again, so we lean into another factor, which is the plan. So sometimes what you plan at the outset, and when you start walking that pathway, you'll discover all sorts of things are on the pathway that you never even considered when you put that original plan together. And so, you know, alongside the method of focusing on the method purely on its own, people can become very attached to the plans that they've set for themselves. And they don't like to adapt and change and move and shape those plans as they start to walk, because that then makes them feel very uncomfortable and, oh God, what are we going to do? Because I wasn't in the plan, and how's that going to work? So, you know, you raise another really interesting point there.
And that's irony in itself, isn't it? Because the plan is about change, and yet I can't change the plan because it's changed. But and perhaps the process, and that's one of the reasons we have scope creep, you know, because we start with a scope and then it just gets bigger and bigger because the plan needs to incorporate different things as we learn going along the way. And maybe the process or the methodology needs to have sort of lay-bys where you emotionally have to get people engaged at each step of the way, not just at the front end and then celebration at the end, you hope, but along the way, so that you do bring all sorts of people and challenges with you. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is just a wonderful point there. So Some of us are more to process. Some of us are more towards change. Some of us are more linear thinkers. Some of us are more non-linear thinkers. Put it this way, and Danny, I completely share your personality in that regard. I'm logical, but it's my own logic. And being aware of that is a major differentiator. And actually how we can come together. I always fancy this Chinese proverb. I read it on LinkedIn, on Facebook, so it must be true, that there's 10 steps between every two people, and it's up to each one to make 5 of them. I also find this conversation really fascinating of how, going back to previous Danny's points, about how many narratives of change we're going here. We switch between organizational change, personal change, we switch between drug addiction, change in organizational strategy, etc. And this, to me, what's really interesting about what we call it Reshape fusion cooking, because these topics are not often discussed together. Because some people, let's say, if you have a really strong personality preference, it's almost an addiction to an preference because you're drawn to it so much. Some people are more drawn to process, some people more drawn to change, and they get quite kicks from it as well. And therefore, it's just being aware of those differences is quite key. Oh, I noticed, Andy, you unmuted yourself. I've been talking for long enough. Yes.
No, I inadvertently unmuted myself, but I did want to say something about what you were just saying there, Nikita. There was potentially, despite all of these different approaches to is it individual change, is it organizational change, different thinking patterns, etc. There is potentially a universal law that links them all together. Mm-hmm. Which I'm sure you know about, so many people know about, and it's the first and second law of thermodynamics. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then there's some brilliant work by a woman called Dr. Camilla Pang, and she's written a fascinating book, which is basically understanding humans. And so Camilla Pang is has autism and an ADHD, and didn't understand how people worked. And one of the things that she talks about in this book is the first and second law of thermodynamics. So the first law is that energy is neither created or destroyed. So energy can only ever change form or location. So if we think about trying to bring energy into changing something, then the energy is always, the same energy is always available, but it changes form or changes location. That's the first law. The second law is the law of entropy, which is basically things become more disordered over time. So the best way of thinking about this is tidying up. And tidying up in a house that you share with other people, your children, your partners, other members of the family, your friends, and somehow that tidying up doesn't seem to work. It gets disordered. So we are, wherever we're trying to change individually, organizationally, science is against us, because if we have low entropy, so not more order, over time, you'll get disorder. And that's within a closed system. If you have an open system, lots of external influences onto people, then it's going to make it even worse. So some of the reasons why change doesn't happen, because it's not meant to, because it can't. The energy will only ever change form or locations. Processes don't work. Why don't people fill in the form? Why don't they change? Because it requires huge amounts of energy in order to do that. So if you think about imposed energy, what we'd also know from psychology, what Roger Baumeister would talk about, ego fatigue, the fact that we only have a certain amount of willpower and it kind of runs out or needs to be replenished. So if we think about what Roberta and Catherine were talking about earlier about kind of resistance and anxiety, well, that might be one of what comes when we are trying to impose huge amounts of energy onto changing, and we get tired, whether we're the change leader or whether we're the recipient of a change, whether we want to give up the fags or whether we want to, change the location or the direction of an organization. Entropy tends to win out whatever we want to try and do.
Fascinating, Andy. Thank you for bringing laws of thermodynamics into it. I'm liking this conversation already. And I'm just curious, Roberta, it seemed to have resonated with you. What are your thoughts on this?
I think just the idea about the energy, because as you were talking, Angie, I really thought about the life and death instinct in terms of the fact that, you know, we're moving towards something, but, you know, you see how people get so fatigued by change. There's change fatigue. And it's like, in the fantasy, it's like, we just do more. If we just put more effort, if we just go that extra mile, we're going to do it. And in reality, people aren't. And so people very rarely think we maybe have to dial back to go forward, which might be actually thinking let's pressure and actually seeing what we've got. And I really like the way that these two laws have been constructed, because they really do speak to a different part of the change process, which is about the life force, if you like, of it, and how we can misuse or use it in helpful or unhelpful ways.
Mm-hmm.
I was reminded of your piece in The Guardian this week, Roberta, which was when you've talked about resilience. The piece was about resilience, as I remember, and about being flexible and adaptable. You talked about, okay, what are the things that I can control and can experience as being is lessening that fatigue. So that is a really, really helpful response to change in general, because you are helping yourself feel less worried about something. So because everybody will have anxiety. Anxiety is an entirely normal, natural process. It's probably the name that we give to strong emotions. But worry and rumination, why can't I? What if I can't control everything? Actually, that experience of your own energy applied to yourself, where things can be okay, and you're learning to adapt despite huge movements towards disorder, can be very helpful kind of psychologically. I wonder whether you could say any more about that, because I thought that article was brilliant that you wrote, by the way.
Thank you. I suppose the thing that does pop to my mind is this idea about radical acceptance, which really I think links to some Buddhist philosophy in terms of really taking away maybe some of the emotional judgments we have about change or any activity, and it is like it is what it is. And I think when you do that, you can relinquish some control. And when we think about letting go and maybe thinking, actually, if I'm worried about A, B, C, or D, I am using energy that I don't actually have to devote to E, F, G. Now, I remember when I was younger, you know, my friends used to say, why don't you ever get worried about exams? Part of me is terrified, but the other part of me is going, there's no point in getting worried, because time's going to pass whether I like it or not. I can either use my time worrying about the time passing or use my time in study. So when I get to the exam, it's different. So I think it's just lovely how you see all these different elements come together. And I think one way of really understanding change is appreciating the diversity of thought and opinions and bringing together in an integrated, bespoke way that really speaks to what you're talking about. But I think radical acceptance and resistance and resilience are really, really important factors. And I love those thermodynamic laws.
It's interesting, isn't it? These factors, how they start to converge around control. You know, different people have very different tolerance levels for control in multifaceted ways to do with the way in which they engage with the world and the way in which they're living. And of course, you know, if you think about, we were talking about linearity, well, that what underpins that is a need for control to be able to see. You know, so it's fascinating how control gets manifested in so many different ways. You know, you're saying, well, the only thing we have control over is in this moment, in the now, if we're lucky. So worrying about the future, lovely example of exams, and worrying about what might happen. It all comes back to that multifaceted angle around, I need to be able to control the future. And actually the reality is we can't control the future, but it's people become so focused, organizations become so focused on these facets, which do follow very linear pathways around the methodology, the process, the plan. It's all control orientated. And actually living more of the being in the now is not something that a lot of people actually take into account.
I agree with you. Sorry.
So I was going to say, it really links with what Linda was saying earlier about actually not being able to change when you're in a change process. And if you think about resilience, it's not just the ability to cope with adversity, it's the ability to adapt. And that's the thing that people can find so difficult, that actual change within a change, if you like. Sorry, Andy.
No, not at all. I was just trying to, I guess, link what you were both just saying there. If we think about, you know, worrying about the future, you know, we can't control it. Your brilliant exam, example. this is back to something I think I was trying to say earlier about if it's probably unhelpful to try and manage change by thinking about it in terms of stages. Your responses to managing change are better if you think about it as a state of mind. So why wouldn't you have anxiety about where you're at right now, like the exams? That's your change state there is something that I have to do, which is coming up, which is, why wouldn't it be scary? So my state of mind will reduce my levels of anxiety about that, because I know it's happening and I'm experiencing the strong emotions I have about it. If I think about it as a stage, I might start saying to myself, why can't I have I done enough? Why can't I sort this out? Why am I worrying about this? So actually, if we think about working with people in terms of how is their state of mind, how is their state of readiness, how is their state of emotionality about that, and work with that, it's probably easier than to try and think, well, you're resistant to a stage, or you're resistant, you've got through stage one. So I don't think stages helps us at all. I think that states probably is a more helpful way to understanding our own personal experiences of change, whether it's happening to us or whether it's happening with us. There is a model, which I guess I've never thought about it in this way before. I'd be interested in somebody to take this up as a researcher. Maybe I should do it myself. There's a model of smoking cessation, which is called the SNAP model. And it basically says smoking, not smoking, attempting, planning. Okay, to give up, attempting to give up, planning to give up. So if we change it, and there's no mnemonic for it now because I can't pronounce it, but if we thought, is it changing, not changing, attempting, planning, I wonder whether that would be a helpful frame for us to think about where are we at in having to respond, those of us in the UK, to moving from lockdown into one of the tiers of lockdown, for example, thinking about a Christmas holiday coming up, thinking about whether we're going to try and are we going to get a relative in or not? We're going to protect ourselves. How is that? Those of us thinking about home as a workplace, for example, being required maybe to go back into an office at some point. All of these different examples that we're responding to, we could be saying, am I changing? Am I not changing? Am I attempting to do something about that? Am I planning to do something about that? So might be more interesting for us to be more resilient with, to think about it as a state we're in rather than a stage that we're in.
Interesting point, Andy. I think I've discovered it's actually probably more of a process. Using your terminology is the word that I've come up with it's just come out in my recently published book. But it's, if we see it as an ongoing process, as opposed to a thing or a phase or then it becomes more manageable, it becomes more movable. Somebody just used a lovely term on the chat about being able to move along the line and changing things along the line. And I think if we're seeing the world as processes of continuous momentum, then that fixed mindset, that fixed focus starts to become less of an issue, I think.
Yeah, and just over to Lind as well, as I noticed you've been holding your hand up, so I hope you don't have cramps.
No, I mean, one of the things that I've been working on in lockdown has been mental fitness and working with Shazad Shameen about positive intelligence. And we've all got saboteurs who are sitting on our shoulders telling us we can't, we shouldn't, we too fat, too thin, we shouldn't be doing this, that, and the rest of it. And it's it's almost like putting yourself into a mindful state for 10 seconds to bring yourself into the positive frame of mind. And I think if you can help people do that so that they are thinking about how to activate positively, how to empathize, how to explore, innovate and navigate through the system, you stop worrying about that exam. So yes, I was exactly the same. I knew I had an exam, I ought to be worried, but by lunchtime it's going to be done. So why am I worried about it? Because at the moment I'm fine. And I think it's a mindset, and it's really interesting because he's got an assessment which looks at your saboteurs and where they rank, and also your happiness and your happiness, your positive mind state. And your mind should be 75% in the positive state, because it means that if you can be very successful in whatever career, with very large saboteurs and inner critics, but you might not be happy. Whereas if you've got a high positive mindset, you can be as successful and you've enjoyed the ride. And so I think a lot of this change thing really needs to be taken back to okay, how are we thinking about this in our minds, and changing people's mindsets rather than saying, look, here's a process, off you go, now go and run it. Because that doesn't tick the boxes.
Indeed, though personally, I'm a bit suspicious about the 75% mark. Like if I had to rank myself, I'm 75% negative and 25% positive, but I live a meaningful life and I'm mostly in the process of flow, sometimes verging on slightly kind of, interesting states of consciousness, put it this way.
You should go and do that. You should go and do that. Just go onto positive.com and go and do the PQ exercise and it'll tell you where you are.
I have an immediate adverse impact when anybody tells me to be happy.
There you go.
If anybody says you need to be 75% happy, I want to shout an explicit that begins with F and second letter begins with O.
It's not telling you to be, it's just saying this is probably where you are. But it's funny because I did the similar with Harvard doing a happiness survey. Yeah. For 3 years doing this. And it was really interesting because the results they always asked what you were doing just before you answered the questions, and what you were doing had such an impact on your happiness level, whether you're at work and not necessarily being stressed, but just where you were in the scheme of things.
Just mindful, we've got a question from Kate. Says, is an exam a change process though? What if you don't know when it was going to be and they could say now, any time? Would that make you different? I guess it's, are we in the moment when we are told? Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, but it also shows that factor of linearity, doesn't it? Because if we are told that something's going to happen in the future and we're given a time and a date for it, and it's something that we like, well, there's some certainty, we're going to go and walk in the countryside or go and walk by the seaside, wherever we're going to do, or go and eat a lovely meal, and that's something that we positively like, then of course yes, that's going to be fantastic. But if you think about an exam, we don't know whether we're going to pass or not before we enter into that process of worrying. Are we going to pass? Are we not going to pass? So it's the level of uncertainty about the exam and how we process that, I think, is the not knowing, because we have no control over the dimension of whether we pass or not, because somebody is judging our work and judging what we write in that exam. So it's a very interesting question.
Absolutely.
I think it really speaks to what Linda was saying about just the importance of the context, because actually the not knowing in terms of when the exam is going to be can actually be very helpful, because I suppose it's about, again, your mind state. So it is about thinking, okay, it didn't happen now, I theoretically have more time to prepare. Or do you look at it like, oh my gosh, I have more time to worry? And as you were talking, it's a really interesting conversation, just listening. Two things popped into my mind. One was change is the only constant, but also nothing stays the same. And these two little phrases were in my mind. And I thought they sat so beautifully in the context of what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
And I agree that, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
I would just say that Heraclitus taught us that thousands of years ago. So the concept of panta rei, which is continuous flow, and I think the phrase that's often attached to him is that you can never step in the same river twice. So everything is changing all of the time. So even the thought about an exam changes your relationship to the exam, because you weren't thinking that before. Go on.
And that's why I like to think about change the spiral. So I know, because I mean, I'm one of these very, well, yes, I like to think about spiral. And you think about change, you kind of like every time you enter or come into contact with something novel, it does trigger and evoke familiar ways of being, because that's how we start to understand uncertainty. However, we're not the same person as when we encountered it before. So you're always moving in some direction. And I think it's how can you get in contact with those more abstract elements about being human and your relationship to different processes?
And that movement towards a direction from the thermodynamics is a movement towards disorder. So if there is any constant...
This pretty lovely illustrates the idea of the thermodynamics about the energy. It's about there's a finite amount of energy and we just change it.
And of course, you raised, going back to that point of Roberta about the spiral, The spiral is we can't see what is above our heads. And that creates that level of ambiguity and uncertainty. And for some people, the spiral's exciting. And it's, oh, okay. And that's what I found with organizations is they can utilize, high performing organizations will utilize ambiguity to create competitive advantage. But, if you've got a lot of ambiguity, somebody asked a question earlier about whether it's change on the inside or whether it's change on the external environment. But the reality is the only place where ambiguity in practice exists is in the external environment. There is no excuse to have ambiguity inside an organization if your organization is operating as an integrated system, because you're sharing, you're engaging, you're working with complexity, and it goes back to that point you were saying, Roberta, about that spiral, not knowing, not being able to see what that path ahead looks like, that's above you, that's above your head, that we haven't got our eyes in the top of our heads, and it's that not knowing, which for some people they absolutely adore and they think it's great, and for others it's the worst thing that could possibly happen to them in the whole wide world.
I think that it's a really curious thing. So if we take the metaphor of the spiral, individual differences, yes, we can't look up and we can't look further beyond a certain distance. And that's why I think in psychology it's so great that when you go in through change, one of the things you can do to limit your anxiety is to limit the time period you're thinking ahead. So if, let's say, a year gives you anxiety, think next 6 months. If that gives you anxiety, a month, and then walk yourself out of there. But to me, what people miss is looking to the side or looking to the people on the journey with them. And this is what I've been doing pretty much with most of my team builds right now. I just give time for people to reflect on what's happening. Because Roberta had this fantastic metaphor last time when she was presenting, that we're all in the same storm, but different boats. And I think this is one of the most important things when we go through change, because of individual differences, perspectives, inclination to change, even neurological wiring. Some people are more reactive and see change as something more positive than something negative is really key. But also just going back to the negative emotions, like, for example, Roberta, I'm just really curious about this. And this is quite a personal question, because to me, there's nothing that makes me seem more kind of red and more triggering than when I feel I'm not allowed to experience my negative emotional affect. And that goes back to childhood. We can go into it, professional help is being sought, but basically, when I feel that I'm experiencing something negative and this is not given credit, nothing makes me experience even more negative. So what are your thoughts and what do you see in therapy? Is it, am I weird and the only one, or is it like a common thing? Please say it's a common thing.
Nikita, is that why you responded to Lindy's question about could you be happier in such a dramatic way?
Well, yeah, plus I'm dramatic by nature and quite narcissistic.
Okay.
So that's contributing factor.
Okay. So maybe if you were 70% happier, you'd be all right. Maybe you should take that course. Go on that website.
Yeah. I'm getting accredited, Nikita, so just shout.
By the way, Andy, if there's some holes in your boat, anyways, that's a different topic.
I think the thing that you said, Nikita, really, I suppose what interests me is the label, and it goes back to language, it's the labels we give things, negative emotions. The reality, emotions are important. They're information, they tell us something. And it's about how do we listen to it? It's what we do with it that I think can be problematic or unhelpful. And so I think I don't know, I suppose I struggle with this idea about negative emotions because it sounds like it's wrong, you shouldn't. And if we think about, the VUCA world that we're in at the moment, 2020, anything that we feel is an appropriate, normal response to an abnormal situation. So I think just even the language we use and the associations and then how that may silence or give space and voice for other things is so important, because we have to give people space to experience what they're experiencing and validate that. And I think the lovely thing about emotions is that they need to be respected and validated and valued, and thoughts about emotions can be thought about and challenged, but we have to give them space. We have to get in contact with them.
And what helps people get in contact with their negative emotional affect? So what can people do to help people to even process that? So let's say if you are in a change management and you have a colleague who clearly scores high on neuroticism and is anxious and worrisome, what are like the key things to keep in mind when interacting with them?
I think that's a really hard one. So I think when we use certain labels around emotions as well, people kind of get very defensive. I'm not anxious, I'm not stressed, I don't this. And so I often try and get people to get in contact with their body to see, where are you feeling it? Because I think then you have a different way of actually understanding something, and that can feel a lot more comfortable. But I think the thing is about being curious. How can we be curious in an empathic, compassionate way? Because I think curiosity is often felt to be intrusive. And I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on this past few months, actually, I'll tell you, I've been reflecting upon this for years, is just the boundaries around work, home, school, play, social. And 2020 has really pushed them all together. And so I think because we're having to work with little boxes, we don't have all the data we'd normally have to deal with in terms of assessing how people are and actually engaging and interacting. People get really scared about asking about how people are because curiosity feels intrusive, because we are now in this different domain between personal and work. So again, I think we're learning how to be and interact and communicate with each other as humans who don't have that physical space.
I think you raised a really interesting point there about people's tolerance levels for working with emotional, sensitivity. Some people can be incredibly emotionally sensitive, and some people can, you could drive over their foot and they don't flinch. But for a lot of people who really have disengaged themselves from their emotions, then being able to help others to be engaging with their emotions, for some people that can be quite a challenge. So, how are we, going back to the conversation about process, how we are processing our experiences and how much of our emotions come into the play based on, what we like, what we don't like, how our experiences and how our inner world experiences, we talk quite a lot to look at the external world or the others or the environment around us. But if you think about when we've grown up in school, we were never taught to look at the nature of the relationship we have with ourselves. And that is absolutely crucial in terms of how we process emotions. And just because we may be comfortable processing emotions, quite a lot of people I've worked with over the years are not very comfortable dealing with other people's emotions because they can't deal with their own.
And I think that's so important. And I think with that, it's about how we interact and how we connect with each other. And one of the things that I found really interesting is about this idea about listening. And I think someone had I saw a word listening in the chat. That's what made me think about it, because we often listen to respond. We don't often listen to understand. And I think any change process always creates so much anxiety. And that anxiety is about mobilizing people to act and do something, and not really appreciate the space and value that comes from just being listened. Because sometimes, I've worked with some people and all they needed to do was one session to be listened to. I'm a brilliant psychologist, don't get me wrong, but I haven't done anything magical. I've just listened and they've come away feeling different. And I think we underestimate the importance of just the basic skills of being a human, and how do we transfer those from the offline world to the online world in a meaningful way.
Absolutely, spot on. I think listening is a thing, again, going back to the environment, is we're always preparing on the inside how we bring ourselves to the outside. So therefore, it's very difficult to truly listen to somebody if there's an internal dialogue that is going on that you can't really see or be there for somebody else's experience. And like you say, so many people, just the whole thing of just being seen and being listened to and can have a massive impact on support.
When you ever go in for a personal chat with your boss or whatever it is, whoever it is, if the boss lets you do 90% of the talking or 80% of the talking, you come out feeling far more positive about that experience than not. So, and it's because you've been listened to. And I mean, one of the wonders of coaching is that people love it because somebody's listening to them, and most people don't listen to each other on the same scale.
I would like to attempt to, I don't know what I'm getting into now, is to reclaim the word anxiety. I think you said something, Nikita, about anxiety and neuroticism and negative emotions, and Roberta noticed that as well. So maybe take this as some group therapy directed entirely at you as the subject. But anxiety, everybody has anxiety, and maybe we could think about anxiety as mental rehearsal. And so mental rehearsal is entirely evolutionary necessary, because if we didn't have anxiety, we wouldn't learn, and therefore we would have been eaten by a predator. So anxiety is an entirely necessary state to be in. And what anxiety potentially does is gives us two routes: to experience the strong emotions that we're experiencing, which might be happiness, might be sadness, might be anger, might be optimism, whatever it is, or to problem solve. And so everybody has anxiety. Some people have negative thoughts about anxiety, and they have worries and ruminations about their negative reactions to anxiety, or they might defend themselves against having strong emotions about that. There's nothing wrong with anxiety. Anxiety is mental rehearsal in order for you to learn from your experiences.
Absolutely, and this rehearsal is very key. I find it really interesting about, there's been a lot of research in neuroticism and rumination. Is it
Rumination?
Yeah, they're more likely to ruminate.
That as well. All of those things.
Yes,
all of those.
And what's also really key is forgiveness. People high on neuroticism find it harder to forgive others, and particularly themselves. So it's almost like inability to process that negative emotions with forgiveness. So it's kind of builds up over time. So it's also really fascinating. I mean, one of my favorite lines out of a poem is by Buddy Wakefield. It's called "Forgiveness. Forgiveness is letting go of all hope for a better past." And that's kind of like it's a really nice override. Because otherwise, your mind might create thousands of versions of how it might have went better, but it wouldn't present you even with one how it could have gone worse. So if your inner critic is active. So it's really interesting to observe those biases of how anxiety throws a spanner in the works. And yeah, absolutely, whenever a really, something really messed up happens, like, a tragedy occurs, which was preventable. I always think if there was somebody, if they listened more to a neurotic, or if a neurotic was on the board, would this have happened? There's also benefits to this. It's like I call it an internalized risk department. So it just depends to what extent you listen to it. Like a little gremlin from the risk department. It's like, well, did you consider all the things that can go wrong? Well, let me tell you how you might be completely incompetent in this. So yeah, it's fun games. But I'm just really curious about right now, as far as change, and considering we're coming up to an hour, to give a bit of reflection time, just what stand out for you so far, or any contributions you want to say, oh, what helps change to happen? Just anything that stands out from the conversation so far. Just want to take a room check. You can go back to Menti and type it in. Energy and trust. Nice. Would you mind unmuting yourself and telling us why you wrote down those words? Completely up to you. Yes, Danny.
That was me. That was me. I just think so. I thought the thing about energy was interesting. I'd actually love to hear more about Roberta's article. If you fancy sharing that later, that'd be really good. Because it is, you've got that whole demands resources model going on, and change is one of those demands on your system that depletes it. So it's kind of it'd be interesting to see the kinds of things that you're talking about to sort of refill your energy pot. And so I really like that idea. And I guess I was thinking about, so I work delivering large scale organizational transformations, right? So I'm kind of like, it takes me a hell of a lot of energy I have to like come up with all this energy to sort of move people. And so it kind of resonates, the idea that I'm pulling this energy from somewhere, and but then, once I've done it, I kind of need a week off, because I'm so exhausted, but it's like it's been transferred elsewhere. So I kind of find that idea of the energy moving around, and I thought that was a really useful framework to look at it in that way. And trust, obviously, one of the things, so it's about, that's coming back to the neuroticism piece that you were talking about. So if I think with these complex changes where you don't know where it's going to end up, it's very hard for people on the outside to trust. So that's one of the things that you have to do, is you have to have to say, look, I can't tell you where it's going to end up, but trust me that I'm looking after you, and I'm going to make the best possible decisions, right? And so those are the two things that sort of stood out for me.
I think you raise a really interesting point, Danny, about this. How do you create this psychologically safe and trusting environment? Because no matter what change comes into the environment, people feel they can come together and they can work together. They're not on their own, and they can feel supported and cared for. And they're all in it together, as opposed to, oh God, how's this going to happen? What's going to work here? So I think mutuality-based environments, and when you've got that trust that's built into the system, no matter what is going on, people feel able to navigate it and they can support each other. So I think, yeah, absolutely, trust is spot on.
I really like, someone wrote, logic is not universal. I really like that one. I'd love to hear a little bit more behind the thinking, whoever put it up, if they're able to, because I think it's a lovely, it's a lovely note.
Hello, this is Britta Erickson, and that pretty much blew my mind because I'm actually reading a book right now, and it's part of a book club, and it's also relevant to the times, so I feel inclined to broaden my understanding of others, right? And so I'm reading the book and I'm coming across these statements that he's making, and I'm like, that's not a logical argument. That's not a logical argument. He doesn't have resources quoting all of this, you know, and I'm trying to have compassion because I haven't written a 330-page book. So I have respect for the work that he's put in, but it dawned on me, wow, you know, it isn't a universal thing. Just because I don't see something as logical doesn't mean it's illogical. So I appreciate that.
That's lovely. I really like that. Thank you for sharing, because it does link us back to, I think one of the things that helps change happen is about, clarity, because I think the assumptions underpinning change processes, where both unconscious and conscious, are part of what causes the difficulties if they're not explicitly known and worked with. So I love that. I think that's going to be one of my quotes for the week. Logic is not universal.
Yeah, there's definitely its own flavors. And yeah, if you want to explore that, Britta further, look for a thing called night move thinking. It might give you an indication on lateral thinking as well. And yeah, some people just make those connections and it's logical to them. But from your argument, again, it's like doesn't hold water, it doesn't have the resources, it's pragmatic perspective. And another key thing I would just like to add from my side is respect. And it's respect for diversity of viewpoints. Because often, let's say this metaphor of growth and fixed mindsets does the job. Dweck did a good, you know, it's universal, it's applicable. But I always say, you know, you need to tone it up a little bit more sensitivity. So what I say, in effective state, you have growth mindset and you have nurturing mindset. Because there's both. Because fixed gives stability in which a seed can take root. You know, you need stability and you need growth. So you have growth and nurturing. And yes, if you overdo nurturing, if you don't respect the growth, it becomes fixed. But similarly, if growth doesn't respect fixed, it becomes chaos mindset. So you have these two layers. And I think whenever we use any terminology which has to do with applied psychology, it needs to respect all the different perspectives or that are brought to the table rather than boxing them in. That's just from my perspective, because if you don't respect your psychological opposite, you cannot build trust, you can't work with them, because respect is just so key. Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Nikita. I was just looking at some of those words myself, and I've got the pleasure of some of the people being on this call today, being some of my colleagues. So Lindy, it's very good to see you, and Alison, it's also very good to see you. And I was thinking about work that I have done with Lindy and with Alison in different contexts before. And what I was looking at here was what Britta just said earlier about logic's not universal, but personal logic is very compelling, isn't it, towards something or away from something. And this idea about understanding why. and work that I've done actually with Roberta as well, with you on in another project I remember, is that sometimes we can apply in large change programs. You've got 3 factors around leadership. So if you think about leadership as creating opportunities for people to get ahead, to get along and do meaningful work, then what might help change happen or prevent change happening or slow change down or transform change in a way you didn't expect it to go to is because it's not meaningful for people. So we have to understand what is meaningful for you. And we can think about meaning in the workplace as, does this help me get ahead, do the things I need to do, and does it help me get along? So even if we think about how you've spoken about neuroticism, the key to neuroticism is a way in which you get ahead, stay alert, look for risks, make sure things don't get broken, etc., etc., etc. So it's part of your rationale to get ahead and get things done. So if I understand that that's meaningful for you, then I'm more able to help you understand why and be able to see how your personal logic might be compelling you towards something or away from something.
Mm.
I was thinking about, there was an article, I think, in Harvard Business Review recently, which talking about the trust triangle. And without that, you know, the triangle is 3 points, is the authenticity. I'm experiencing the real you. Logic, I know you can do it, your reasoning and your judgment are sound. And then also, and the last bit is empathy. I believe you care about me and my success. And so without that trust level in there, you're not going to be able to engender and advocate what you want to get done very easily without all of that.
Absolutely. And talking about what you won't be able to get it done with, what stops change from happening? Just if people can jot down. So we already have lack of followers. I don't know. Sometimes you can change yourself. Lack of communication, absolutely. Mindset.
No, I meant, sorry, I don't know if I'm still, lack of followers is if you've got a leader, you have followers. So leadership and followership. So unless you've got a large, broad participation across an industry or across a group of people, you're not going to be able to get that change to get going. You've got to have, I don't know what's the word, mass, if you like, to drive it forward.
People now use the term gravitas, seems to be in vogue right now as well. So yeah, badly understood, fear. Anything is standing out to people, or if people want to unmute themselves and tell us why they wrote down what they wrote down.
I think the priority thing is really, really interesting to me, as it goes back to some of the things I was trying to talk about earlier, about if we think about personal change away from bad habits or things which are problematic for people, perhaps around addiction, then change seems to be more sudden and spontaneous than we might expect, because when people change, they give it a high priority, and there isn't necessarily anything which leads up to that. There could be quite a lot of situational cues for that, or some personal motivations to change, but there doesn't have to have been led up to. So when it becomes a high priority, when what I want and what I ought to do combine, and there are the opportunity to do that, then change happens. So that not being a high priority is really something that I'd want to try and understand if I was managing change systems in an organization. How can we make this a high priority? In what ways is this? Why isn't this a high priority? What else is going on for people? What are the triggers which would lead to that? What are the things which are allowing that not to be a high priority now? Because perhaps other things are a high priority.
Absolutely. And are those priorities shared? And did people discuss, or did they think, because it's my priority, it's everybody's priority, and everybody knows exactly what this priority is going to look like? So, yeah.
Which is back to that idea of imposing order, entropy, things become disordered over time. Perhaps there is a universal logic in there somewhere.
Can I just say, could there something be a little bit simpler as well about resourcing, which is one of the words I put in, that often we forget that a change takes resource. And linking to what Andy's just said about priorities, if I've got a set of priorities and you want me to do this different thing, but you're not resourcing it, then that's going to make it difficult for me. So I could be completely on board, I can be trusting, I can love the change, completely be on board with it, haven't got the time, haven't got the people, whatever. And I think sometimes some of this, we do need to get back to just basic management planning. And, you know, there's some really highfalutin stuff we can say around emotions and all of this, which I think is really important from the psychological. But often it's plain, simple management. Have we given people the resources they need to make the change?
I agree with you, Kate. And I think that for me, that would be, I want to, I ought to, but I can't. So I need more resources. And Kate, everything's psychological. Surely everything's psychological.
There's some really lovely examples, though, guys, of what happens when you don't look at us as an organization or as a process as being systemic. You see so many when you know, you see so many organizations when they're split into silos, and they have all of these various different types of change agendas. And you know, if the regulators come in and say you have to comply to these regulations, then that's the priority of the change for the week or the month. And then you get, so what you start to see is organizations start to become bombarded with so many different contexts of change and projects and programs. And it all comes back to like the lovely point about management, but are you seeing your organization as an integrated system and how much stress you are putting on it by making all of these different change contexts, or everything is a priority and a quick, get it done. You know, it's what I call transition blindness, is not being able to see the stress that you're putting on your system because it's not aligning back up to purpose. And everything's, you know, if different people have got different agendas and they're not supporting each other for the collective whole, this is where you just get system overload.
I think that's really important. I think there's also another thing about how do you help people to get in contact with the reality of the situation. So linking with what you're saying, Kate and Catherine, about resources, I also think a lot of organizations don't want to see the reality. It's like, we're going to have this change process, but it's business as usual. And it's like, how does this work? And so I think a lot of my work is actually just saying the emperor's naked, the emperor is wearing no clothes, because they don't want to actually get in contact with the reality, which is they're setting up a system or a process that isn't going to succeed because they aren't actually resourced effectively or adequately.
Can I ask another thing?
Please, go ahead, Kate.
The other thing I noticed in companies is if you want to get ahead, you need, your annual report needs stuff on it. Now, doing the same stuff as we've done before safely and well doesn't get you ahead. It's a bit like trying to publish a replication. You've got to find results. So you've got to have results. You've got to show you've done something. You've been a change agent. So you've got to bring in change. You then bring in a change. Your annual report's glowing because you've done it. You move on. The change then falls apart and everybody has to scrabble around and survive it. And then the new manager comes in and they're going to bring in another change. But we never have this long-termism in companies to see, well, what are the impacts of these changes 3 years down the line? So I think a lot of this is we have to have change because that's built into a management, you know, performance system. So I think a lot of it goes back, is it the right change at the right time? Or are there other factors driving this? And I think that's quite often what the followers are thinking. It's survival because they're doing another change because they've got to.
And if you look at things like emerging...
On purpose. Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
Thank you. I think, Kate, if you look at studies around emerging leadership, then often what gets rewarded is people that want to change stuff. And then exactly as you said, they move on and they don't do particularly well. So the organization looks for people to change it for the short term. When if you look at things like stock values of companies over time, it's run by leaders who have greater levels of longevity, that don't tend to push to make change happen, that do understand how their organization works and know the detail. So counterintuitively, perhaps, often organizations reward emerging talent in their organizations who are perhaps not as neurotic as they could be, Nikita, and are more bold and ambitious and more narcissistic, and then tend to break stuff, because breaking stuff is what gets rewarded in an organization. So we may well be consuming what isn't good for us organizationally without realizing it.
And over to Danny.
So I feel I have to correct something here. I think you guys have a sweeping generalization, startlingly negative view of organizational change that doesn't correspond with my experience at all. And I'm seeing only part of it, but I think it's quite unfair. I think there's a sweeping generalization. I think it depends what industry you're in. So if you're in an heavy engineering industry, they are long-term thinkers, because they're engineers and they're very focused on safety. And if you put an oil rig in, that oil rig is going to be working for 50 years. So you build it so that it's going to last 50 years. So, but if you're in sort of a fintech or something, you are thinking more short term. Or if you're in a VC backed thing, you're thinking about floating it on the stock market and what's going to increase your EBITDA multiples. So it's all these different things. I feel that it's just a bit too negative the way that everyone's talking. It doesn't feel authentic to me, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing I wanted to say is this desire for change, I think, is universal. And the reason I say that, if you look at, George W. Bush and Barack Obama were both elected on the basis of bringing change. Like, there's something about change that's attractive in leadership as well. And I'm just interested to ask the question, is that something that you've noticed? Because it sounds like it's not necessarily the right thing, but I know certainly I'm drawn to change, but that's my personality. But there seems to be something overall that's en masse is attractive to people who promise change.
I think you're raising a couple of interesting points there, Danny. I think one of them is yes, changes. I personally find change exciting. At the same time, I find that quite a lot of organisations unintentionally get in their own way because of the topics that we've been talking about. And I think, a lot of what is of summarising up what we've been talking about for, since the session started. But there's some real basic stuff about leading change and leading into the unknown, and the unknown can be exciting. Things like purpose. When your change processes are aligned to the purpose of the organization, if you can ask the question around what is the purpose of this change and how does it align to the purpose of the organization, that takes out a lot of unnecessary complexity and mess and prioritization and edges around management and resources. And one of the things that I found over my research over the last 20 years is that when some basic aspects are put into place, like clarifying purpose and building that into the way in which the organization works, then leading change is exciting, it's fun. Organizations love it. I spent 11 years, I used to work for Morgan Stanley, investment management organization and financial services, and we loved it. Right back in the 90s, we had an amazing time with change, and it was fun and it was exciting. And it, my experience is that a lot of it is to do with how the infrastructure of the organization is built, and how some of these historic leadership practices, like how leaders utilize power. Do they utilize power as a way of controlling people rather than creating a system, an integrated system to take the workforce with it on the agenda? So I think you're absolutely spot on. It doesn't have to be negative. The question is it operating as an integrated system of bringing together human beings for the purpose and for the good of the organization and society in general?
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm just conscious of the time and we're going to start wrapping it up. So I'm just really curious, what are your key takeaways or take forwards from today? So after we all discussed about the positives, negatives, different factors ranging from individual differences and coping mechanisms to geopolitics and natural resources, I would be just quite curious if you can type in what are your key takeaways from today? And then we'll have a bit of time to discuss and unpack it a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Oh, by the way, Cheryl, a very interesting comment about you, from you, about programs and redundancies. Would you mind unmuting yourself and sharing with us?
Yeah, I've worked for a couple of different companies, and in some ways, I'm lucky that I got out actually in the first round of redundancies, because for one company, I think there was another 4 sort of changes or structure changes that brought in redundancy. And I know things, you know, financial packages and everything else, but when people are having to reapply for their own jobs time after time, and sometimes, you know, and not necessarily, when sometimes you see who survives and you're thinking, well, actually, are they the right person for the job? Are they still the deadwood because they toe the line within the company, and actually is the deadwood what the business needs? So yes, as I say, I've been lucky that I've come out within the first round of redundancies, but it doesn't do well for everybody else left behind, because in some ways there's just the anticipation or the anxiety of when's the next round coming, you know. And sometimes with the change programs, the business isn't allowed to settle. And also when I was in the military, because to go to certain ranks, you have to do certain postings in different environments. And I know from the workshop I was in that if people got posted, senior officers got posted to our unit, then the next, when they left us, they were promoted, and they'd come in and change everything just for the sake of changing, like Kate raised earlier, you know, because they had to make their name so that they definitely get the promotion.
Absolutely. So for somebody, change management can be a promotion. For some people, a redundancy. Yes. And when you have ambiguity and not sure, you don't know which one is going to play out.
No.
And what are people's thoughts on what's coming across as takeaways from today? I can see some nods, some smiles.
Can I just say something? The co-word in co-production for me, because if you've got everybody along from the beginning, if you've asked people what the change should be, how it should be gone about, you've actually involved people, you've got your guiding coalition, if we want to use Cotter, and you've actually got people on board, then you're halfway there. And this is one of the things I always find with change processes. It always seems to be starting at the wrong point. And I've been to, I mean, I remember having an interview going back. I mean, actually, I think it was one of the army interviews, Cheryl, where they said, you've got the, or something like that, you've got this change. How do you go about sorting it out to your team? I said, well, I wouldn't have done that in the first place. I'd have wanted to involve my team in deciding what the change should have been, so that when I have to then tell them, right, this is what we're doing, they've already been involved, because they're the people on the ground who know the nitty gritties, the detail, that often, you know, the devil in the detail. They know what could actually be coming up to know what the problems are going to be. So I think that co-word is such an important one, because if we're doing this top down, we've already missed the trick. And I think that, you know, unless it's something that's urgent and, you know, it's something that we've got to say, right, this is coming down from the top, we're going to be directive. But otherwise, if we're being participative as leaders, then we should never be actually implementing a change that's a shock to anybody. They should already know about it.
Danny, over to you.
I think that's a really interesting point, because this is something that comes up again in psychology a lot. And I think we have a natural bias to want to include people. But I don't think that's always the right thing. But I think there are two levels of change that you need to look at in an organizational piece. So an individual change, for example, you might not want to have everyone participate in because it might be very technical, it might be very detailed. It's like, asking people to vote on Brexit. We're not qualified to understand whether Brexit's a good idea or not. So asking the country to vote on it wasn't a good idea. Sorry, I don't want to be political, but there are things in organizations that actually you need expertise to understand how to put in. And those things you don't necessarily want to, hey everybody, how should we set up our technical Wi-Fi network so that it's secure? You don't want to encourage everybody to weigh in on that. You want to say, this is how we're going to do it, and by the way, you get to alter the color of your screen. But then there's other stuff that's bigger. But I think there's a different level as well, which actually you do really need that participative piece in, which is that small change is one of the whole host of changes that are going to be going on. So you might not necessarily want to get people working on that small change, but actually working on the whole structure comes into communicating meaning, communicating purpose, building trust. So there's a bigger picture of all the changes that are coming in your relationship to the people who work for you. But I don't think it's necessarily, I would argue it's not necessarily true in every specific change that you have to have a participative approach.
Absolutely.
So I know I'm not going to be very popular. So
it's case by case basis. For example, Trevor here says, I think you want 100% input to the outcome. So 100%, Trevor? What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, I'm going to unmute, aren't I? Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the challenges around the level of input of employees already comes with an assumption as to where the line is drawn. I think you could, and certainly the way that I try to work is actually I get input before the change decision is even made. So, for example, we use the Wi-Fi thing. Well, how do we know that we need to improve the Wi-Fi? Who is telling us that the Wi-Fi needs to be improved? And so quite a lot of the time, I think actually the employees are the ones doing the job. They will have a sense of what they need day to day. And organizations tend to use information as power quite a lot of the time. So they can hold on to huge swathes of information that mean that you can always draw a comparison between the quality of the knowing of employees and the quality of the knowing of those people in charge. The more you share that information, the smaller that gap gets and the greater the contribution. So the Brexit example, despite the fact it's political, is a brilliant one. If we all had the level of knowledge that was needed, or at least the level of knowledge that was necessary to make smaller decisions, that was a really big binary decision. But actually, if we had the quality of knowing to be able to make much smaller decisions, then it wouldn't have been something that you can't put out to people. It's more the question was wrong and the level of information was wrong for those people to make the decision.
Actually, I'm really happy we're discussing Brexit right now, because the first time I heard about Brexit in 9 months. So it seems like the pandemic anxiety is subsiding, or I don't know, or the Brexit anxiety is increasing, that we're actually it's back on the agenda. I literally haven't heard anything about it for 9 months. So I just want to acknowledge that little shift. And I just want to kind of, because I'm aware of the time, just we'll close in remarks by our speakers, and then we'll wrap up, and there'll be still time for discussion afterwards.
I'm glad to hear that Brexit's made you perhaps towards 70% happier, Nikita. Yeah.
Maybe 5%.
Okay. It's just been fascinating to have the opportunity to both to talk to people here and to listen to the debate. So thank you, everybody. Nikita, thank you for inviting me. And Catherine and Roberta, it was very nice discussing it with you.
I will second that. Thank you. It's been really interesting. And I think one of the biggest things that I'm going to take away from today is the fact that talking and thinking and engaging in change is never a dull process. There's never a dull moment. It is alive and kicking. So thank you, everybody, for your contributions to chat and for, how making this afternoon, a Friday afternoon, really, really thought-provoking and stimulating. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to second what my colleagues have just said. It just highlights for me how many facets there are around when we start talking about change and how many factors come into play. and it isn't a, you know, as we've said, a linear, straightforward task. So it's been really lovely to kind of unpick. Feels a bit like we've been pulling apart these different dimensions and kind of getting underneath the lid on it. So thank you very much for your questions and for inviting me along.
Well, thank you everybody for your participation today, and I'm definitely taken away from the individual perspective, importance of trust, respect, but also that acknowledgement that we all have different responses to change, and we see change differently and how we interact with it. And there's things to be excited about, as Danny mentioned, and there's also things to be worried about. So maybe 50-50 and on a good day. But thank you everybody for participating. This video is going to be uploaded to YouTube and it will be accessible hopefully in the next few days. So I'm going to just stop my share, stop record, and then we can just, yeah, done.